Hey guys, today we're going to be going over item components in tank support items and what order to build them in. And I think it's really an important topic that's overlooked because oftentimes the power that you get from a recall is determined by your choice of what component items you're buying. And unfortunately, it's can be kind of complicated to weigh the pros and cons of getting one component versus another, and many newer players just assume that the game is balanced or built in such a way, which would make sense and would make it a lot easier on all of us, if the component item that costs the most was simply the best one. And if you couldn't afford it, then maybe you go another one instead because you can get to that one. But for the most part, you would just, kind of build the most expensive one. We'll see that that's not always the case by going through the way that I would build the components in each of these tank support items. And hopefully you guys find this one pretty helpful. So there's a couple of things that we need to think about when we're directly comparing them. We're literally just comparing what we're getting. So let's talk about some examples here where we have an item that's more expensive than another item, but isn't going to actually help you that much. So here we have Ruby Crystal and we have No Magic Mantle. So No Magic Mantle is 450 gold, so it's more expensive than the Ruby Crystal at 400 gold. However, we get a lot more value out of Ruby Crystal than we do out of No Magic Mantle. Now, thankfully, I think most people know this one. You maybe wouldn't assume that you'd want to start a No Magic Mantle when you take your first recall on support anyways, because, why go No Magic Mantle into bot lane that's, their 80 carries doing most of the damage. So most people would maybe intuitively understand that one. The other thing is that when we talk about like tier 1 boots versus Ruby Crystal, tier 1 boots are also cheaper than Ruby Crystal, but I think tier 1 boots are a little bit better than Ruby Crystal. So let's talk about those and why that is. So to understand this and to really get the comparisons that we're making, I think it's helpful to look at these charts real quick and remind people about how they work. So first off, when you buy health versus armor and magic resist, there's essentially this line that someone's created that talks about the efficiency between buying armor versus buying more health. And what that means essentially is that if you buy, 1,000 armor but no health, that's not actually as efficient at making you more tanky against physical damage than if you bought the proper balance that the game wants you to buy between armor and health. And so there's basically just a line that you can draw at which you say, if they have this much, physical damage, I need, and I have this much armor, I need to buy this much health to pair with it. And so when we're building component items, we don't get to pick exactly how much health and exactly how much armor or magic resist items have, but we can try to build somewhat along this curve so that we're not completely, inefficient in the way that we're buying tank stats. The other thing that's important to understand is that armor and magic resist, and this chart says armor, but it's exactly the same for both armor and magic resist, gives you percentage physical damage reduction or percentage magic damage reduction. So at these different values, like 30, for example, we have 23% physical damage reduction. And when we move from 30 to 40, we start to see diminishing returns, where each jump to the next level gives us less and less physical damage reduction, which is why we have to pair it with more and more health in order for it to be efficient. And so we can use these charts and think about, what we're talking about here when we're comparing buying cloth armor to Ruby Crystal or when we're buying No Magic Mantle versus Ruby Crystal. So let's talk about those because these are some basic, boots, cloth armor, No Magic Mantle, and Ruby Crystal are going to be the basic component items that you're always thinking about in almost every tank support item. So let's talk about that. Early in the game, you're not going to have very much HP. In fact, we can see here that if we start the game around 40 armor and magic resist, which we usually do on support, roughly, we're going to have a little bit more armor than magic resist, but we'll get to that. You're going to want about 1,750 HP before you start buying more armor and magic resist. And that is a lot more than we have. This is one of the reasons why Warmogs is an item that makes you so efficient in terms of tankiness compared to other items, and one of the reasons why it's quite good right now. So when we think about what we're getting when we buy the No Magic Mantle, let's even say that we're starting at 30. We might be starting at like 35 or 34 or 37, somewhere in that range, depending on what champion we're playing and all that. But if we're starting at 30, which is a little bit generous, we're about 23% magic damage reduction. And if we get 25, we'll move to 55, which is right here between 50 and 60. So let's call this 35. Moving from 23 to 35 is going to give us about an extra 12% magic damage reduction. So if we were to take, you can think about it like this, all of our health that we have early, let's call it 1,000, which is also generous because actually very early, sometimes you have even less than that, especially if you were to build No Magic Mantle first and not even pick up the Ruby Crystal. So let's say that we have 1,000 HP. If we're blocking 12% magic damage, even if we were taking all of our health, 100% for magic damage, it would only block 120 damage. But we just saw, right, that Ruby Crystal gives 150 health. So obviously, that's why this chart shows that that's not really worth it, because, it's not blocking very much, essentially. So let's go back here to the client and take a look. So when we have 150 health versus No Magic Mantle, which if you had 1,000 HP, and 30 magic resist to start, would block 120 damage if you were taking 100% of your health in magic damage. So obviously, these are very generous scenarios. You might have more than 30 magic resist to start out. You might have less than 1,000 HP, especially if you don't first back the Ruby Crystal. You're going to have 50% of your damage dealt to you is going to be magic damage, and that might even be generous when we're talking about bot lane. So, depending on their support, their bot lane could be anywhere from full AP, in which case this might be better, and you might actually be looking at 100% magic damage, to 70, 80, 90, 100% AD, in which case this is doing nothing for you. So, but obviously we can see that even in that scenario where you were taking 100% magic damage, this is still getting outdone by Ruby Crystal, and it's more expensive. So we obviously prioritize Ruby Crystal. Now, when we talk about movement speed, it's a little bit more complicated to compare because it's not quite as simple as mathematically this one makes you tankier, so you have to go this one. But boots are going to give you 25 movement speed, and if that 25 movement speed is going to allow you to essentially do 150 extra damage or take 150 damage less because of your ability to dodge, because of your ability to run away in space, or because of your ability to chase your opponent down and do extra damage, then boots are going to make up and for what Ruby Crystal is giving you, and then some, while being cheaper. And so I think that having those tier 1 boots right away, especially if you buy them on your first back like this, and potentially have the advantage of having boots versus someone who doesn't have boots, which means you always get to outrun, chase them down or be able to run away faster than they can catch up. This is very powerful, and I do think it could translate into you doing an extra 150 damage, or dodging 2 abilities or something like that on your first turn back into lane. And so I think tier 1 boots actually outpace Ruby Crystal. So I would prioritize tier 1 boots, then I would prioritize Ruby Crystal. Now we haven't talked about, and then obviously below Ruby Crystal we have No Magic Mantle, but we haven't talked about Cloth Armor. So Cloth Armor gives you 15 armor for 300 gold. And so what we have here is if we're starting with about 40 armor and we gain 15, we're going to go to 55 again, which is about 35% damage reduction. And coming from 40 to 35, so we're at 29 to 35, which is 6% damage reduction. So, again, this is actually in some ways even worse than what we're looking at when we're talking about No Magic Mantle, because it's giving you so much less armor and you start with a higher amount of armor. So if we think about that 1,000 HP example again, and it's giving us 6%, that would be 60 damage that cloth armor would block if you took all 1,000 of your HP in physical damage, which again, even though this item is 300 gold and ruby crystal is 400 gold, it doesn't even come close to the power that you get from ruby crystal, because ruby crystal is giving you 150, but cloth armor is giving you at maximum 60. So ruby crystal is at least 3 times as good at blocking damage in this, early scenario as cloth armor. And these are good scenarios because we're assuming 100% physical damage. It would be 6 times as good as cloth armor if they were only doing 50% physical damage to you. So that's really quite bad, right? And so essentially what I would do is I would prioritize boots, and then I would prioritize ruby crystal, and then I would prioritize no magic mantle unless their bot lane is really heavily AD. And then I would prioritize cloth armor because you have less magic resist. And so you can see that, because it's increased cost and it gives you more magic resist and you're starting with lower magic resist, no magic mantle seems to be outperforming cloth armor in terms of damage reduction. But of course it does depend on the damage composition of their bot lane a little bit. And the other thing we should talk about is, well, what do I do if I have 300 gold but you're telling me to buy no magic mantle first? I'm going to give you an order of priority, but if you don't have enough gold to buy the thing that's best, buy the thing that's second best if you can afford it, so that you're spending almost all of the gold that you have every time you recall, even if it's a little bit less efficient. You want to spend all the gold that you have when you recall. Now let's talk about Kindle Gem. So Kindle Gem's only going to give you an extra 50 health, but it's also going to give you 10 ability haste. So is 10 ability haste plus the 50 health going to be better than buying cloth armor or no magic mantle? Well, we know from this example that even if you were taking 100% magic damage, no magic mantle is going to block 120. And even if you were taking 100% physical, cloth armor is going to only block 60. Now, more realistically than 100%, we're actually going to think about it more like 50-50. If they're dealing about 50-50, you're only going to block about 30 damage from cloth armor. So again, for 400 gold, you can get 50 damage blocked instead of 30, and you can get 10 ability haste as well. And so that's going to be much better than buying the cloth armor. Over here with no magic mantle, the numbers are a little bit different, right? Instead of 120, it might be doing 60. And so the question is, would we rather have, if they're doing 50-50 physical and magic, would we rather have the extra 10 damage blocked, 60 instead of 50 that Kindle Gem gives you, but lose out on the 10 ability haste? Well, obviously 10 ability haste is a hell of a lot better than, 10 extra damage blocked. So we're going to choose Kindle Gem over cloth armor or no magic mantle. So again, the order of priority that you would actually try to build a Locket in is tier 1 boots, then Kindle Gem, starting with ruby crystal, then Kindle Gem, then no magic mantle, then cloth armor. But again, if you can't afford things, you're going to build a certain way. So just because you want to prioritize Kindle Gem doesn't mean that if you have 300 gold, you should buy glowing moat instead of cloth armor. You should wait on Kindle Gem and just buy the cloth armor with your ruby crystal, and then get the Kindle Gem later when you can afford it, instead of getting glowing moat, which is just giving you 5 ability haste instead of the damage blocked. And I don't know that the 30 damage blocked that you would get with, actually for only 30 damage, 5 ability haste might even be better. So maybe you should be going glowing moat over cloth armor too. So I would, again, boots, Kindle Gem, no magic mantle, cloth armor. But again, let's say that you have, you got boots, you got your Kindle Gem, and you've got 300 gold. You're going to buy cloth armor before no magic mantle. It's the order of priority if you can afford it. If you can't afford it, you move on to the next thing and buy the next thing, even though it's a little bit less efficient, because it's more efficient than having nothing. So let's talk about Warmogs now. Warmogs is another really interesting one where the build path can be quite unique. So All of these components start with ruby crystal, and we've just gone over how important buying health is and how much better it is to buy health compared to, armor, magic resist, or other components. And this is one of the reasons why Warmogs is so good right now, is because it's chocked full of health, and it gives you more health than any other item in the game when you need a bunch of health early. And so it's quite good. Now, we're going to obviously start by buying a ruby crystal, but then what do we do if we have different gold values? Well, I guess the argument would be winged moonplate versus giant's belt versus like getting more ruby crystals. Obviously, crystalline bracer is not very good, and we'll get into that when we talk about why you would build it last. But it depends on the gold that we have. So if we have 500 gold, and we could buy either giant's belt or winged moonplate off of our ruby crystal that we started with on our first back. Giant's belt is going to give you an extra 200 health on top of your ruby crystal, whereas winged moonplate is going to give you no health, but it's going to give you 5% movement speed. Now, depending on whether you've bought boots or not, you could have anywhere from like 350 movement speed or 340 movement speed or something like that, all the way up to 400 if you've bought boots. So let's say that you have 440 movement speed. You get 5% movement speed. That's going to give you 17 movement speed. Now let's say that you bought, or that you had, you bought boots. You have 400 movement speed already. 5% of that would be 20. So all that we're getting for our 400 gold here is 17 to 20 movement speed. So it's a different question than when we had boots versus ruby crystal before. With boots, we got 25 movement speed, and we traded that for 150 health. Here, we have 17 to 20 movement speed, which is, 8 to 5 movement speed less than boots. And we're trading it for 200 health, which is what Giant's Belt would give you on top of Ruby Crystal, instead of 150 health. So that's a little bit harder to justify compared to the trade-off between Boots and Ruby Crystal. So a lot of people are upgrading to Winged Moonplate because they want the movement speed for roaming. It sounds good on paper that you'd want more movement speed on support in order to be able to roam and things like that. Maybe you can go Swiftness Boots early and then Winged Moonplate, and they kind of sound like they would have some synergy together, whereas like Giant's Belt doesn't really do anything other than give you health. But to be honest, I think that the extra 17 to 20 movement speed is not going to allow you to do an extra 200 damage or dodge an extra 200 damage worth of stuff, on your one life. The reason for that, I would say, too, is you can kind of think about it another way. Let's say that we have 1,000 HP and we've gone, Winged Moonplate or like Boots and Winged Moonplate. It could be, Tier 1 Boots, Winged Moonplate. It could be Swiftness Boots and Winged Moonplate or something like that. If that's what we've gone, then we probably only have like 1,000 HP at that point in the game. If we have 1,000 HP, dodging 200 damage means that we're saying that not the movement speed from our tier 1 boots, not the movement speed from having Swiftness Boots, just the movement speed that we're getting from Winged Moonplating as a bonus is allowing us to dodge 1/5 of our HP or 20% of our HP worth of damage on our life. I think that is a little bit too much to assume that you would get that. So it's a little bit thin, right? You're going to have to make a judgment call on this. But for me personally, I don't think you're going to be able to dodge 20% of your HP worth of damage at that point in the game, just from the movement speed you're getting from Winged Moonplate, from an extra 17 or 20 movement speed. So I would prefer to buy Giant's Belt here and then Winged Moonplate. Now let's talk about this other option I talked about, like Ruby, Ruby, Ruby. So Ruby, Ruby, Ruby would be 1,200 gold or 800 gold if we are, had backed and bought this ruby crystal first, like we talked about with these other two, and then if we have 800 gold, buying ruby on top of our first one would give us an additional 300 health, whereas this Giant's Belt is cheaper, sure, but it's only giving us 200 health. So obviously, if we can afford to do it, we're going to want to go for 800 gold. You wouldn't be able to get Giant's Belt and Winged Moonplate. That would be 900 gold. So if we back and we have ruby already and we have 800 gold, we'll go double ruby, which will give us an extra 300 health. If we back and we have 500, we'll go Giant's Belt. If we back and we have 900, a little bit more than ruby, we'll go Giant's Belt and Winged Moonplate. Why? Because we'll get 200 HP from this, and we'll get 5% movement speed. Now the trade-off is that 5% movement speed versus one additional ruby crystal. And so now it's 17 to 20 movement speed versus 150 health instead of 17 to 20 movement speed versus 200 health. So that's a little bit more back in line with Boots being better than Ruby Crystal, as opposed to Winged Moonplating being better than Giant's Belt in terms of health versus movement speed. So I know that's very confusing, but to recap again, if you back and you first back Ruby Crystal, on your second back, if you have 900 gold, you're going to go Giant's Belt, Winged Moonplate. Uh-oh. Wait, Giant's Belt would be 500. Winged Moonplate would be 800. Oh, so that would be an extra... That would be a lot. That would be an extra 1,300 gold. I'm doing the math wrong here. So actually, you wouldn't do that because you can't buy Giant's Belt plus full Winged Moonplate. I was thinking for some reason that this was 400 plus 500, but actually you need the whole 800 here. So if you back, unless you have 1,300 gold, if you have 1,300 gold, you're going to go Giant's Belt and Winged Moonplate. If you have 900 gold or less, if you have 900 gold, but can't afford Giant's Belt and Winged Moonplate, you're going to buy 2 ruby crystals. If you have 500 gold, then you're going to buy Giant's Belt. And if you have 400 gold, you're going to buy Winged Moonplate. Now, let's talk about why Crystalline Bracer is not good compared to these other ones. So Crystalline Bracer gives us an extra 50 health and 100% base health regen. And so essentially, the upgrade, which costs us 400 off of the Ruby Crystal, is giving us an extra 50 health. And depending on our base health regen, we're going to have to figure out how much that is giving us. So let's take a look at Braum's base health regen and see how much 100% base health regen is kind of going to give us. So his, where is it? His health regen is 8.5. This would be at level 1, I'm assuming, to 25.5. He gains 1 per level. So when are we buying Crystalline Bracer? If we're arguing that we're going to buy it first, then, maybe we're having, again, tier 1 boots and then Crystalline Bracer, or tier 1 boots into tier 2 boots and then Crystalline Bracer. So we're buying it, again, about 1,700 gold into the game, or a little bit less. So let's say that we're level 6 or 7 in that area. So at level 6, Braum would have 12.45 health regen. And so gaining 100% means that we're going to double that to 24 per 5. So how much is 24 per second? It's about 5 per second. And so assuming we're actually missing HP, we're going to gain 5 HP a second. And so if we could utilize that, for example, let's say that we're talking about with Giant's Belt, gaining 200 health for 500, right? And that seemed to be the best option if we could afford it. How much would we need? We'd need to regen an extra 150 health, because this item gives us an extra 50 health. So if we take the extra 50 health it gives us on top of Ruby Crystal, plus an extra 150 health regen, then we'd get the same 200 extra HP and for cheaper from Crystalline Bracer. So how many seconds of health regen would we have to be undergoing at 5 health regen roughly per second in order to get to 150? So it'd be 150 divided by 5, or if you want to get really specific, it'd be 150 divided by 4.8. And the answer that I get is 30 to 31.25 seconds. So this is a revelation to me. This is why we're doing this, right? This is really important. Again, nobody builds Crystalline Bracer first. I would argue now that Crystalline Bracer first is better, because I think you can easily get 30 seconds where you're not full HP and you're making use of your health regen for 30 seconds while you're alive after you've bought Crystalline Bracer. And if you use it for more than 30 seconds, your health regen, so if you're missing HP for more than 30 seconds, which you do a ton of the time on a tank support, especially if you're into a poke matchup or something like that, if you're missing your HP for more than 30 seconds on that recall, you're going to make back the health that you would have from Giant's Belt. Now, it's a little bit complicated, though, because it's not that straightforward that automatically makes it better, because in an all-in, or if you come back to lane at full HP, you do have less HP, and if you do play around the fact that you have more health regen than, and that health regen is going to get you to that extra health that you're looking for, you'd have to be careful with the fact that while you have more health regen than the opponent, they also have health regen. And so this isn't like an absolute advantage where if you're taking, 30, 40 seconds to health regen in order to get the same as Giant's Belt would get after a trade, you're also looking at potentially, you're potentially looking at less of an advantage there, because they're also spending some of that time health regenning as well. But you are outpacing their health regen, of course, because you have Crystalline Bracer. So honestly, these three items are a lot more balanced than I thought that they were going into this. I would say that there's definitely an argument for Crystalline Bracer, but you'd have to play around it more and make sure that you're utilizing your health regen, where you can trade with somebody and then spend 30 seconds regenning or something like that. And it doesn't have to be all at once. It could be trade, spend 10 seconds health regenning, trade, spend 10 seconds health regenning, trade, spend 10 seconds health regenning. You get to 30 seconds quite quickly that way. And then you're really utilizing your HP, and then you might get more value out of Crystalline Bracer than Giant's Belt, but it's certainly more difficult in the sense that you have to actually know to play around that item, even as a simple component item. But yeah, there's an argument for Crystalline Bracer. But like I said, in a raw all-in, you would have less HP. So if it's not a situation where you can back off and actually capture the reward for having more health regen, you would put yourself in quite a bad situation, actually, by having less HP during the all-in. But again, even during an all-in, if you're missing, let's say the all-in lasts 10 seconds, you're regenning 50 HP, plus the items giving you an extra 50 compared to Ruby. So that's an extra 100. Giant's Belt is an extra 200, so it's not that bad, even in the middle of an all-in. Of course, if you're ignited, that'll be cut a little bit as well. Interesting stuff here. I'm trying to come to a conclusion here on Crystalline Bracer versus Giant's Belt and tell you definitively that you should, either build Giant's Belt first and then, maybe Crystalline Bracer and then Winged Moonplate. But to be honest, it's pretty close. it may even depend on the matchup, right? Like if you're in a poke matchup, you know, if you're playing Braum versus Karma and you're spending 90% of the lane health regenning, then Crystalline Bracer is going to be absolutely gigantic because you know, imagine you spend 3 or 4 minutes health regenning instead of 30 seconds. All of the sudden, you're gaining way more effective HP from Crystalline Bracer than on a Giant's Belt. But on the other hand, if you're in a matchup where you're not getting poked, you're versus another tank support, if you can't use that trade pattern or they just regen the HP as well, then Giant's Belt ends up being better. The other thing I would say is that this was heavily dependent on us looking into Braum. So let's pull up another tank support as an example. Braum has a particularly high health regen, base health regen, because he is particularly vulnerable to that type of poke and gameplay. So let me just see as a baseline whether a champion like Leona has similar health regen to Braum or not. Yeah, actually Leona and Braum both start at 8.5, and Braum gets 1 extra health regen per level per 5 seconds. Leona gets 0.85, so very close, but a little bit less than Braum. So yeah, on Leona or a champion that has less base health regen than Braum, you would get a little bit less value from Crystalline Bracer, but really not that much. You know, it's just going to add a second or two onto the thing. I think if you're in a poke matchup, or you feel like you can trade and not die and back out and then, you know, wait for your health regen and then keep doing that, wear down your opponent and play around it, I think Crystalline Bracer first is actually the best one, which is crazy because I considered it the weakest one. And that's why we look into this. We learn things. And I would go Giant's Belt second for the same reason versus Winged Moonplate that we talked about before, because I feel like the raw health that you get from Giant's Belt is better than the movement speed would be able to provide you. And then I would go the movement speed from Winged Moonplate and then finish it off by completing the item. And that's how I would go about building Warmogs. Obviously, Bramble is very simple because it's just cloth armor into Bramble, so there's no struggle building that or any of the boots. QSS, only 1 component item, very easy. So Knight's Vow, right, like we talked about before, this is going to get a lot easier now that we've covered these component items. On a lot of these things are going to be relatively self-explanatory. So obviously the health that we're getting from Kindle Gem is a lot better than the armor that we're getting, because we're at that stage in the game where, you know, we don't really even have to do the specific math on this one. We can see from that chart that if we're sitting at 40 armor, you know, we need 1700 health. And so if we're below 1700 health, we should be buying Kindle Gem, which we're going to be at, you know, basically every single time. So you're going to go Kindle Gem for, you know, Ruby Crystal, Kindle Gem, and then Chain Vest, and then Knight's Vow. We should actually look into, because of how good the health regen was on Crystalline Bracer, we should look into... Interesting, too. Wait a second. We need to go back to Warmogs for a second. So I was about to say we need to look into Rejuve Bead. Oh, never mind. Wait. Okay, it's fine. I was going to say we need to look into Rejuve Bead versus Cloth Armor, which is a new one. And apparently health regen goes pretty hard. This is probably why Rejuve Bead got nerfed, because remember, people could actually start 3 Rejuve Beads. So the Shen players who were starting 3 Rejuve Beads were absolutely onto something insane. So we need to compare this, but I was going to say go back, and since this, I believe, builds into Crystalline Bracer, which it does, is there a comparison here between Rejuve Bead and Ruby Crystal, actually? So again, 100% base health regen. We assumed level 6, but of course, if we're talking about potentially building this before Ruby Crystal, we would be like level 1. And that makes a big difference, because this number kind of, you know, at level 6 is like double. And then we're doubling it with the rejuve bead, so it makes a big difference. So even at level 1, if we have 8.5 base health regen, with both Leona and Braum have, we would end up with, instead of 8.5, we double that with a rejuve bead to 17. And that would be 17 per 5, so it'd only be 3.4 health per second. And so how long would it take to get to 150 health regen? Take 44 seconds. That's not that bad. So let's say that we could go rejuve bead first, and at level 1, you know, we wouldn't really be buying it at level 1, so it's actually even better. Because level 1, obviously, we're still talking about starting the support item. So we're actually talking about going rejuve bead, you know, when we take our first recall, which might be level 3, level 4, level 5, somewhere in there. So let's say that we're recalling and we're buying this more at like level 4. At level 4, Braum has 10.77 base health regen. So that would be times 2. Or not times 2, divided by 5. So that would be 2.154 health. Uh-oh, I think I'm doing the math wrong. Yeah, we do times 2 and then divided by 5. Because we're doubling our health regen per 5, and then we want to find out how many per second. So we're regenning 4.3 health per second. And to get to 150 HP, which is the same value that we get from a ruby crystal, it would take 34 or 35 seconds of regenning in order to get the same HP back that we have from ruby crystal. And again, I think it's totally reasonable that on a life, you're spending 34, 35 seconds regenning your HP in bot lane. You might spend easily a couple of minutes in between each recall, maybe even longer in lane. You might spend 5, 6, 7 minutes in lane without recalling. And if you do that, you know, you might be health regenning 50% of the time. You might be health regenning potentially less than that. But even on the low end, maybe you're regenning a third of the time. You're just missing some HP. And if a third of the time you're missing some HP and you stay for 6 minutes, that's 2 minutes of regen, which is, you know, 4 times as much time as you need to spend regenning to make up the ruby crystal. It just makes you a little bit weaker, you know, on the all-in, because you don't have that HP. You have to play a little bit of a different game, like we talked about with Crystalline Bracer. But so I would say, again, going back to this, I would say, especially if you're in a poke matchup, but even in general, if you can play around it, I would go rejuve bead first, and then start picking up the ruby crystals like we talked about before. So you're going to go rejuve bead, you know, and then you're going to go Crystalline Bracer, and then you're going to go Giant's Belt, and then you're going to go Winged Moonplate. Again, just building the reverse order. If we've completed Crystalline Bracer, but we can buy 2 ruby crystals afterwards instead of buying Giant's Belt, it's better to buy two ruby crystals, because they're going to give you 300 HP as opposed to 200 from completing Giant's Belt. But other than that, that would be how you would go about building Warmogs. And then to return back to Knight's Vow, I would actually say then, because we think that Rejuve Bead is better than Ruby Crystal, I would actually go Rejuve Bead first. Although, again, it's a little bit different if you're out of lane. Because once you're out of lane, you're definitely spending less time getting poked and harassed like that. And less, you're spending way more time on full HP if you're just wandering around the map on support. But still, we're talking about a 30-second break point. maybe if you want to consider that Ruby Crystal is better in a straight up all-in scenario where you can't back out and come back in after you've regened, then, maybe we say that in order to be as good as Ruby Crystal, you have to regen for 40 seconds or 50 seconds instead of 30 to come out about the same. But even then, of course, you're going to do that every life. So I would say, it depends on whether you're building Nice Vow first, in which case Rejuve Bead would be even better, or if you're building it later and later on, it might not be as good. But probably you're going to go Rejuve Bead first, then you're going to go a Ruby Crystal into Kindle Gem, then you're going to get Cloth Armor, Chain Vest, and Night's Vow. And again, if you find yourself in a situation where for some reason you've bought Rejuve Bead and you can't afford the Ruby Crystal, you're probably just going to pick up the Cloth Armor, and then next time you back, get the Ruby Crystal if you can into Kindle Gem. You just return on your previous build path, but try to utilize the gold that you have in your inventory. So that covers Locket, Warmogs, Night's Vow. Vigilant Wordstone, one component, that makes things nice. Redemption's pretty simple, right? Because we obviously want the Kindle Gem on a tank support versus the Forbidden Idol. Obviously, if you're a hyper healing champion, you actually prefer the 8% healing and shield power and 50% base mana regen as opposed to 200 health. I mean, if we think about it, right, if how much healing and shielding would we need to do to get to 200? Well, if it was 10%, which it's not, then the math would be really easy, right? You'd have to do 2,000 healing and shielding to get to 200 health here with Kindle Gem. It's actually quite a lot, by the way. And it's not even that good. It's that would be if it was 10%, but it's 8%. You get some base mana regen here, but this gives you the 200 health plus 10 ability haste. I would even say on enchanters, and I actually do this, but I thought it was something that I did because I like having health. I put a lot of value on having health, especially when I'm playing enchanters, because I'm not used to playing the characters and I feel really squishy and vulnerable compared to playing a tank support. I tend to prioritize for myself just having more tank stats on enchanters anyways. So I've always built Kindle Gem first, even when playing enchanters. But this definitely sounds like, very rarely as an enchanter, especially early into the game, are you going to be doing 2,000 healing and shielding or more in a fight. You'd have to do 2,000 healing and shielding in a fight, and again a little bit more than that, just to, it would be 1,000, or would it be 2,400? Let's try that. 2,400 times 8%. That's not quite right. Oh, it's more than that? You have to be doing 2,500 healing and shielding for 8% of that to equal 200 health for your team. Now, again, 200 health on you, actually as an enchanter, 200 health on you is more important than 200 health on your allies. So I would definitely say that you're going to want to prioritize Kindle Gem even on an enchanter. So that's 2,500 healing and shielding that you would need to be doing to break even with the health on Kindle Gem. But then Kindle Gem also gives you 10 ability haste compared with 50% base mana regen. And obviously 10 ability haste is going to allow you to heal for a hell of a lot more. Or do a lot more, whether you're playing a tank support or an enchanter. It's going to allow you to do a lot more than 50% base mana regen would, and it's higher value. So you're pretty much always building Ruby Crystal into Kindle Gem into Forbidden Idol. I don't know why everybody wants to build Forbidden Idol. Now, I guess the argument would be that on some enchanters, right, you shouldn't be taking any damage at all. And so if you're building somewhat glass cannon, almost like an 80 carry or a mage would, where you're, yes, it would be efficient for you to build some tank stats, but you can just use your positioning in order to not need that HP in the tank stats, and you can just do more damage as a result. And if your positioning is good, then you're able to get away with it. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, you get focused down a lot on an enchanter. I think that you can utilize the 200 HP. And so I would say that the 200 HP from Kindle Gem is going to be just as valuable to you, and a lot of enchanters are doing nowhere near 2,500 healing you know, on a life. So I wouldn't do that unless you have a lot of healing and shielding. Okay, moving on. We have the exact same build path, the exact same argument with Mikael's. You're going to do the same thing. Unless you're doing well over 3,000 healing, you know, so it's 2,500 to make up for the 10 ability haste. You know, let's say that you need to do, if the 10 ability haste, if you were building it early on and it was almost 10% cooldown reduction, let's say that resulted in you doing 10% more healing and shielding. You know, that would increase this 2,500 that you would need to do by an extra 10%, which would be another 250. So unless you're doing 2,750 healing or shielding per life, you should probably be going Kindle Gem first. Yeah. Abyssal Mask, right? Similar situation to what we had before. You know, this is very similar to Knight's Vow, except we don't have the Rejuve bead messing with things here. We're comparing a bunch of magic resist. We had like 40 armor here. Here we have 50 magic resist. 50 magic resist is a little bit better, but of course it is a little bit more expensive, but that's okay because we prioritize, you know, if we can buy the whole thing outright versus, you know, we'll just go the other thing if we can't afford it anyways. So we are getting a little bit more magic resist than we were getting armor from Chain Vest here, and we are getting, you know, magic resist instead of armor, which is nice because if we need it, then it's good because we had lower starting magic resist. But, you know, Kindle Gem's just going to outperform Negatron Cloak here every time, especially because of how powerful the health is, and this also gives you 10 ability haste, whereas this isn't giving you anything else. So you're going to prioritize, you know, Ruby Crystal, Kindle Gem, Negatron Cloak, and then Abyssal Mask if you're building this item. When you're building Frozen Heart, you know, this is one of those items where you don't really have many choices. You've got Cloth Armor, Cloth Armor, Cloth Armor. You got like a Glowing Mote here and a Sapphire Crystal. Warden's Mail is a hell of a lot better than Glacial Buckler. So why is that? Well, first off, this gives you 40 armor, and this gives you 20 armor. However, this gives you 10 ability haste and 250 mana, but Warden's Mail actually comes with a passive that reduces incoming damage from basic attacks. Generally speaking, when component items have a passive, you have to look into what the passive actually is and what it does, but generally speaking, that's going to be a lot more impactful than one that doesn't have one. You know, generally speaking. But so Warden's Mail, unfortunately, the stupid client doesn't show, so let's look it up real quick so we can actually make sure that we're accurate on Warden's Mail being better, but you know it is. So let's look it up here. Okay, it says here that Warden's Mail, rock solid passive, every first incoming instance of post-mitigated damage, basic damage per cast instance is reduced by 5 plus 3.5 per 1,000 maximum HP, maximum 20% reduction each. So let's say that we have 1,000 HP. Actually, when we buy Frozen Heart, because we're not going to be buying it first item ever, especially on tank support, you're going to have probably more than 1,000 maximum HP by then. So this would be even more. Let's just, you know, to give Glacial Buckler even a shot, but Warden's Mail can obviously be better than this. Let's say that you've got 1,000 max HP. You're buying Warden's Mail really early on for some reason. This would be more like if you were building Frozen Heart first, and again, you'd be building it second or third or something. But, you know, so you've got 8.5 damage per basic attack that's being reduced. Let's see, every first instance of post-mitigation damage. That's great too, because that means that like it's doing it after your armor's already being applied. So your armor, they come in with 100 damage auto attack. Your armor already cuts it in half to 50 damage auto attack. And then it's being reduced from 50, you know, by 8.5. And so it comes in and it hits you for, you know, 42 or whatever, or 41.5. So the way that it applies is quite good and quite efficient. It obviously depends on how many basic attacks you're taking, but you know, we're already dealing with less armor on Glacial Buckler. So this is giving obviously Warden's Mail is making you a lot tankier because it's double the armor of Glacial Buckler, 20 to 40. If we go back to comparing the items here. Oops. 20 to 40, plus Warden's Mail's passive. Let's say, so let's say at 1,000 HP, it's doing 8.5 damage reduction. Let's say that you take like 15 autos or something like that. That'd be 127.5 effective HP that you're gaining back. So, with the passive giving you, and I think 15 autos, this would be over the course of your entire life or recall, right? Obviously, that's, not even close. So you're getting somewhere, it's a little bit hard to estimate how much you're getting from Warden's Mail, but you're getting double the armor plus like an extra passive that's giving you like 130 to like 150 extra effective HP. If you're buying it later on, it's even stronger because you're going to have more maximum HP, and so the passive's going to block even more damage for you. Maybe we're talking about later on, if you have 2,000 maximum HP, maybe we're closer to, we might be closer to even, 200, 300 damage blocked if you took 15 auto attacks with Warden's Mail. So unless you think that the 10 ability haste is going to make up for double the armor and, somewhere between 150 and 300 damage blocked per life from Warden's Mail, the Glacial Buckler just doesn't even get anywhere near it. So you go Warden's Mail, then you go Glacial Buckler, and then you go Frozen Heart. I would prioritize, especially with how much armor you're already picking up in an item like this and how much armor you already have. When you're building Glacial Buckler, I would prioritize picking up Glowing Moat, then Cloth Armor, then Sapphire Crystal, unless you're a champion that for some reason really needs a lot of mana, but most tank supports really don't need the Sapphire Crystal at all, which is why this part of the item is particularly bad, because obviously you're giving up a lot of armor here in order to have the mana in this item, which doesn't really do a whole lot for you. At least the ability haste is helping you a little bit. But yeah, so obviously I would prioritize, picking up the Cloth Armors into Warden's Mail first, and then Glowing Moat, and then Cloth Armor, and then Glacial Buckler, and then Frozen Heart. Now for Thornmail, we've gone over this one before. This is going to be kind of radically different because we've covered Thornmail before, and we've talked about how the passive from Bramblevest is so strong because it's the same passive minus a little bit of extra Thorns damage as you get from Thornmail. Most of the reason why you build Bramblevest and Thornmail is as anti-heal. And you get the same exact anti-heal passive from Bramble as you get from the full Thornmail. The only difference is that Thornmail gives a little bit of extra Thorns damage. So it might be nice, you're thinking, oh great, we like the health, we get, Giant's Belt, and then we finish Thornmail. But there's not really much incentive to spend the extra 1,900 gold that it cost on top of Bramblevest to get to 2,700 gold to complete Thornmail. Instead, you could just be building Giant's Belt or a Kindle Gem or some health into some other item that you want. A Giant's Belt into a Randuins, or a Kindle Gem into an Abyssal Mask, or a Kindle Gem into a Knight's Vow. You get the idea, etc., etc., etc. So really on this item, it doesn't matter that Giant's Belt... well, actually, Giant's Belt's just not a better component than Bramble because Bramble's passive is so crazy, especially if you're building it in a situation where they actually have a lot of healing. So Bramble Vest, then Giant's Belt, then Thornmail, but actually just skip the Giant's Belt and the Thornmail because you can buy Bramble, have the same anti-heal passive, and throw 1,900 gold into almost completing your next tank support item without ever having to complete this. Then at the very end of the game, when you're, building your final item, you come back to Bramble Vest and then you upgrade it to Thornmail, to make use of that item slot. But, you would only build it last. Okay, Randuins. Okay, this could be quite an interesting one because we have Warden's Mail, which is quite good. But we've got Giant's Belt here, which is also quite good. And so let's think about whether we would want to build Warden's Mail or Giant's Belt first. Me personally, and we'll see if this is correct, I happen to, if I go Randuins, build Warden's Mail first and then Giant's Belt, but these are two I haven't compared. And it's going to be a little bit difficult to compare because we just did Warden's Mail, And Warden's Mail is a little bit hard to calculate because it's going to depend on how many auto attacks you take. But we can try to, give it a shot and see where the break-even point is between these two items. So we know right off the bat that when we compare the armor that we get from Warden's Mail to the health that we get from Giant's Belt, that the health is going to be a lot better than the armor. So 350 health, right, is going to represent 350 health. 40 armor, if we go back to our chart, we're building Randuins later in the game, though. We're building it as like a third or a fourth item. We're going to assume that we have, 2,000, 3,000 maximum HP, and we're going to assume that we probably picked up 2 items or 3 items before this, and we've got armor per level and base armor, and so our armor's not going to be at 40 anymore. It's going to be, it could be low. It depends on what items we're building, but it could be anywhere from 70 to like 140. So let's settle in, it's probably somewhere here around like 100 armor. And so if we have 100 armor, we have 50% physical damage reduction. So to gain 40, we'd be going all the way to 140. So we'd be going from 50% physical damage reduction to 58%. So if we have 8% physical damage reduction, and we've got 3,000 HP, if we took 100% of our 3,000 HP from physical damage, we would block 240 with the 40 armor only from Warden's Mail. Of course, we're probably not going to take that much, so let's do the 50-50 scenario, where we're taking 50% of our damage from physical, 50% from magic. So the 40 armor on its own is blocking 120. So 40 armor, if you're building Warden's Mail and Randuin's, as like a third or a fourth item, roughly speaking, it's blocking about 120 damage. Giant's Belt is blocking 350, but that's just the 40 armor part. Then we take into account the Rock Solid passive, and the Rock Solid passive was, let's pull Warden's Mail back up here. Five plus 3.5 per 1,000 maximum HP. So let's start with 2,000, but we could do 2,000 or 3,000 maximum HP. Depending on whether you're building it like third or fourth, or, that's going to cover a lot of scenarios. So if we've got 2,000, then this would be 6, 7. So 5 plus 7 would be an extra 12 per auto attack. So let's say that we took 15 auto attacks. That would be 180 damage blocked. It's post-mitigation, which is great. So 180 damage blocked post-mitigation. So that 180 plus the 120 that we were getting from the 40 armor would add up to 300, which is actually a little bit less than Giant's Belt if you've got 2,000 HP. So Giant's Belt actually does outperform Warden's Mail if you have 2,000 HP. But 2,000 HP is the low HP scenario. So rather than 2,000 HP, let's say you have 3,000 HP by the time you're building Randuins. If you have 3,000 HP, you're going to get 5 plus 11.5, which is going to give you 16.5 damage reduced per auto attack, which would be 247.5. 247.5 plus the 120 you're blocking with the armor. The 40 armor on Warden's Mail is 367, which outpaces Giant's Belt. The other thing I'll say is that even if you're 2,000 HP, remember that we were assuming that you got auto-attacked 15 times. If you got auto-attacked more than 15 times, it is possible that you'd see, even at 2,000 HP, Warden's Mail past Giant's Belt. So let's see where that break-even point is there. How many auto-attacks would you actually have to take? I think 15 is a reasonable number. I think it's actually kind of a lot. So, but we're talking about over the course of your whole life on that recall. you know, Giant's Belt, obviously you could recall if you were losing that 350 HP and then get that HP back. So we had 5 plus 7 was 12 damage per auto attack. So we have like 120 plus 12 times X equals 350. So if we take 350 minus 120, we get 230 divided by, what was it, 12 or 15 per auto attack? 12 per auto attack equals 19.16 auto attacks you would have to take. It's kind of a lot. Not going to lie, I think if you're building Randuins and you only have 2,000 HP, you probably need to be building Giant's Belt first. The good news is, and we actually talked about this in the support item video, Randuins is really an item that you should be building only if they have 3 crit champions at like 50% crit, or 2 crit champions at 75% plus crit. Or if they have more, obviously you should be building it. So it's not really something, if they have to be at 3 items and have 2 crit champions, you're not going to be building it until 3rd item. So the question is, on support at 3rd item, do you really only have 2,000 HP? I think it's possible if you don't have Warmogs. I think it really could depend. I think you could be much closer to 2,000 HP if you don't have Warmogs. If you have Warmogs, you'll be closer to 3,000 HP, in which case Warden's Mail is better. So it's kind of weird. It's like if you build Warmogs and you have closer to 3,000 HP by the time you're picking up Randuins, then you should go Warden's Mail first. If you are closer to 2,000 HP, then you should probably go Giant's Belt first. But of course, that's assuming 15 auto attacks. If you think that they're actually going to auto you 20 or 25 times, then Warden's Mail performs better. I don't know that that's true. Well, you may think that in your head, that it takes that many auto attacks to kill you. Nobody's going to sit there and auto you 25 times in a fight. It never happens. The reality is that at that point, that person who's trying to auto attack you should be ignoring you, and they should be killing you with spells or with champions that can actually do more damage than that to you. Their AD carry should not be hitting you 25 times. If they're hitting you 25 times, they're trolling. Okay, that would be, imagine an AD carry in a team fight sitting there for like 12 to 20 seconds or something like that, just hitting the support over and over again. That would be like the whole team fight. They're just sitting there hitting support over and over. If you're that tanky on support, you want them to hit you that much. They're just trolling. So there's no way that you should be, hit more than like 15 times by an auto in a fight, even if you're kind of tanky. So that would be the case on this one. That one's kind of interesting. They're pretty close there. Unending Despair. Okay, this one's easy because we just have the health compared to armor again. So obviously we're going to be going Ruby Crystal. This is kind of a conundrum. A Ruby Crystal versus a Kindle Gem. I think that's the first time we've seen this one. So would we want to upgrade the Ruby Crystal into Kindle Gem? We get an extra 50 HP and 10 ability haste. Or would we rather get the extra 100 HP, but then we miss out on the 10 ability haste? That's kind of close as well. Like, if you have no ability haste, but I think you build Unending Despair later, no? No, it doesn't look like it matters that much. Actually, let me look up Unending Despair. I think there's a reason why I think that. I think it's because the passive gets stronger by level or something like that. Yeah, every 5 seconds in combat deal 30 to 50 damage based on level. And then it also is based on your 3% of your bonus HP. So if you build, if you build it after you have like a Warmogs or after you have a bunch of HP, it's going to be stronger. So although it doesn't initially sound like Unending Despair would be an item you'd want to build later, it's actually an item that is more efficient if you got more HP first and you're higher level first. Is it based on their level or your level? That's always a confusing one. I actually don't know, because that kind of matters on support. But either way, we're probably building it a little bit later. The reason why it matters whether you're building it earlier or later is because if you're building it early and you have 0 ability haste, then 10 ability haste is going to be like 8 or 9 cooldown reduction. 8 or 9% cooldown reduction. If you're building it later and you've already got like 30, 40, 50 ability haste, then the ability haste here isn't really going to help you very much. It's got, you know, marginal returns. Diminished, what's the phrase? What's the phrase for it? Diminishing marginal returns. Marginal diminishing returns. I think it's marginal diminishing returns. Anyways, economics, a graduate, by the way. Okay, so I would probably go Kindle Gem because I think you're going to get 100 damage or 100 damage blocked on most tank supports from having 10 ability haste. But if you're building this way late and you already have way more ability haste than you need, you're already at like 30, 40, 50 ability haste, then maybe you go double Ruby and then Kindle Gem, then obviously Chain Vest, then Unending Despair. For Kaenic Rookern, oh, I love the build path on this one for whatever reason. You go the Ruby Crystal. Oh, except we talked about this. Actually, you would go the Rejuve Bead. Oh, that's kind of confusing. Oh, here we go again. Okay, so normally what I would do on this item, but that's about to change, is normally I would build the Ruby Crystal, and then I build the Negatron Cloak. The reason for that is because upgrading to Spectre's Cowl only gives you... it's very expensive. It costs an extra 850 gold from Ruby Crystal, whereas this one's just 900. Actually, that doesn't... That's actually cheaper. Okay, but this gives you 25 magic resist, and this gives you 50 magic resist. But this gives you an extra 50 health and 100% base health regen. Maybe you should just be going... Okay, it sounds like probably you should, now that I understand how OP health regen is, sounds like you should go Rejuve Bead, because we prioritize Rejuve Bead versus Ruby Crystal, and we know Ruby Crystal is better than no magic mantles. So I would go Rejuve Bead, then Ruby Crystal... then Spectre's Cowl, then Negatron Cloak, then Kaenic Rookern. Now let's talk about that for a second. So, yes, we get an extra 25 magic resist, but we're already prioritizing these components, and so we're so close, essentially, to completing this anyways. Well, let's talk about that. So even if we assume that we just sit on these two, what we get for upgrading this, so 700 gold... This would be an extra 550 gold, and we get 25 magic resist and 50 health. Well, either way, you would build the no magic mantle next. So you'd only get 50 health from upgrading this if you have all three components. And so if we go Rejuve Bead, Ruby Crystal, and then we have to build this or this either way, then how much gold is this together? 850 plus 300 is 1150. So it's an extra 100 gold for 50 health to complete this, and it clears up all three of these item slots into one, versus, like, you know, going here to here and getting like Negatron Cloak, which is like 25 magic resist, but obviously much more expensive. Yeah, I would just build Rejuve Bead, Ruby Crystal, no Magic Mantle. You can finish Spectre's Cowl. Then I would, you know, go no Magic Mantle, Negatron Cloak into Kaenic Rookern. It doesn't really matter at this point to compare because it's 100 gold for 50 health. I think that you just take that. There's just... I mean, comparing 100 gold for 50 health to 450 gold for 25 magic resist is a little bit of a ridiculous comparison, because then we're not really talking about practically in the game. Is 25 magic resist, especially at the point that you're building a Kaenic Rookern, which is like second or later at least, Is getting 25 magic resist going to be worth 50 health? Probably not. Let's double check real quick on the chart. So, you know, let's say we're like 60, we're getting 25, we're getting 6%, maybe a little bit more, maybe 6 or 7%. If we had 1,000 HP, that would be 60. Or 70 if it's 7%. Okay, so actually, instead of completing Spectre's Cowl, I would go no Magic Mantle if you can afford it. But obviously, because it's 450 versus 100, so obviously that big of a price difference, you're probably getting more from no Magic Mantle. Even at that big of a price difference, you're barely getting more from no Magic Mantle. But if your inventory space, right, is in a point, which it probably will be if you're playing support and you've got like your support item plus boots plus these 3 component items is going to take up 5 slots. If you've gone another item first, your inventory's full with these 3, so you literally can't go this. So you have to finish this first, unless you're building Rookern first item, in which case I guess if you were building Rookern first item and you could afford no Magic Mantle, then you could build no Magic Mantle again instead of finishing Spectre's Cowl, then come back. Oh, and then you would go Negatron Cloak. Since this is Negatron Cloak upgrade is literally the same. It's another 450 for another 25 magic resist. So it's literally just 2 no Magic Mantles. So you would actually upgrade Negatron Cloak then, and then you would finish Spectre's Cowl, but you'd sit on all 3 of these components. You only have enough inventory space to do this on support if you're building this first item, which you rarely do. But maybe if you were versus double AP bot and you were building this first item, you would do that really weird build path. Some of these items that we put in, like, you probably shouldn't build these. I'll still kind of go over the basics, especially because some of them are viable on some tank supports, like we talked about. You know, I despise Zeke's, but it's actually good on, like, Rakan and certain supports that can really, Rakan and Rel, who can really utilize the active on it better than most champions by forcing multiple champions into the passive of the item in a way that other support champions can't do. So obviously, same thing. This is the same build path as Locket. So with Zeke's, you're just going to go Ruby Crystal, Kindle Gem, no Magic Mantle, Cloth Armor, and Zeke's. And then if you can't afford something, obviously, like we said, you skip to the next thing. Fimbulwinter, obviously, if you're intending to get the tier, you're going to need to, especially on a champions that doesn't stack the tier as well, you have to buy the tier first in order to be able to stack the item up and get access to the, that passive or whatever from the item. So you're going to buy tier first. Then we're going to go Ruby Crystal because it's going to be the baseline component for either of these items. And so then our question is whether we want to get Kindle Gem or Giant's Belt. Did we answer this before? No, because this doesn't have Kindle Gem in it. So I think this is the first item we've seen with Kindle Gem and Giant's Belt in it. So for 500 gold, we get an extra 200 health. Here for 400 gold, we get an extra 50 health, but we get 10 ability haste. So do we think 10 ability haste is worth 150 health? What item is this? Fimbulwinter? So this is probably something I assume that you go first, or maybe you just buy the tier and then you complete a whole nother item and then you come back to it and you're doing it like second. But I would assume you'd want this item as soon as tier is stacked, so you're building it like first or second. So you probably don't have a ton of ability haste. So if you're getting like 9% cooldown reduction or something like that, is that going to provide you, again, 8 or 9% cooldown reduction? Is that going to provide you with an extra 150 damage or damage blocked? Very thin. Very close. Basically, they're about the same power level. It's a hard call. It's going to depend on your champion. It's going to depend on how much you're able to do with your ability haste. I will say one thing about ability haste, though. I do think ability haste, there are certain champions it's great on. I think ability haste, especially on support champions, is very overrated. Now, why do I say that? I say that because a lot of times we've talked about one of the things that helped me improve to Masters and GM was ability timing, holding my abilities and being very patient with my abilities instead of spamming them. Cooldown reduction does nothing for you if you have an ability that's a 10-second cooldown and you get 10% cooldown reduction. It takes 1 second off the ability. Are you going to fire that ability 1 second after it comes off of cooldown? If you're a mage and you're spamming damage spells in a rotation, sure, having ability haste is going to be really good because it'll help you get more damage out. It's like attack speed for mages. But if you're a support and you're holding Bami, it doesn't matter if it comes off of cooldown 1 second or 2 seconds earlier, because you're going to hold that thing for a long time until the right situation comes up. Even with Braum Q, you're not going to spam that thing necessarily off of cooldown. And it's a shorter cooldown anyways, so the ability haste is working on it less. Yeah, actually you can spam Braum Q off of cooldown. You're also more likely to miss abilities if you try to spam it right as it's coming up, instead of like doing the normal thing where you like let it come up and then you readjust and wait for a good situation and then you throw it. So my opinion is that ability haste baits people into playing the game like it's Earth, which is the opposite way that you actually want to use your abilities, because you want to actually save your abilities, be patient with them, and hold them for the best thing that you can use them to counter and to throw it out against, and for good timings, even with damage abilities, for good timings to be able to hit more people, or to kill somebody when they're in a really bad situation instead of just doing a little poke damage and then letting them walk away. Holding your abilities is really a big difference between how high elo players and lower elo players play. So I think ability haste is overrated for that reason. So for me personally, if I was building Fimbulwinter and it's this close between like Giant's Belt versus Kindle Gem, I would probably go Giant's Belt, and then go Kindle Gem, just because I don't think the ability haste is that important. Certainly you are building it more like a first or a second item though, so if the ability haste is good early. Depends on the champion. Ability haste can be great to pick up before your ult, for example. So having your ult on so let's say your ult is like 2 minutes long or a minute long. Even at a minute long, 10% is going to knock off. Oh, it's not even that much. Yeah, I mean, see, same thing here. It's almost worse with your ult, because your ult you're going to want to hold for a specific situation even more, depending on the champion. There are some champions that want to spam their ult and go in off of cooldown, and there are some champions that want to wait. Champion that actually builds Fimbulwinter is like a Taric or something like that, is a champion that's not going to just spam their ult when it comes up. They're going to want to wait for a certain circumstance. Well, if the ult's a 60-second cooldown, it only shaves 6 seconds off of the ult cooldown. So are you really going to save somebody's life because your ult happened to be on Taric up 6 seconds earlier, or if it was a 2-minute cooldown, which is more like what Taric ult is going to be, it's going to be a longer cooldown. If you shave 12 seconds off, is that going to make it come up earlier? And so even though you have less HP with Kindle Gem, the 8 ability haste there is going to allow you, or 10 ability haste, 8% cooldown reduction, about 10% cooldown reduction, is going to allow you to have 12 seconds off of your ult, and that's going to allow you to potentially save somebody's life if you have to use ult in that duration. Maybe it's possible, and maybe that's more impactful than the health, but it's pretty close. So for me personally, I would build Giant's Belt, because I don't think ability haste is as good as people think it is. If you really like ability haste, or you're playing a champion that wants to spam their abilities, then obviously ability haste is better. Okay. Trailblazer. Okay, this is a simple one, right? We got health versus armor again, so we're going to go the health part. Oh, okay, so this is kind of interesting, though. So now we have Winged Moonplate, though. And so the Ruby Crystal is giving us the full 150 HP, so we're only getting 5% movement speed. So now do we think that 5% movement speed is better than, like, Cloth Armor? Yes, we do. The reason for that is because when we were doing this comparison before, and we were talking about all kinds of different movement speed, on boots and Winged Moonplate and stuff like that versus Ruby Crystal and stuff like that, it was pretty close between Winged Moonplate, the 5% movement speed from it, and a ruby crystal. And a ruby crystal, we know, is a lot better, like multiple times better than cloth armor. So if it was close between Winged Moonplate and Ruby Crystal, I'm just going to, tell you that Winged Moonplate movement speed is going to be a lot better than the armor. The armor is going to give you like 6% physical damage reduction, which is only going to be like 3% total damage reduction if you're taking 50% armor and 50% or 50% physical and 50% magic damage. So if you had 1,000 HP and you're taking 3% less damage overall, it's only blocking 30 damage, the cloth armor. Can you dodge an extra 30 damage or do an extra 30 damage with an extra 17 to 20 movement speed? Yes, obviously, by far and away. So if you're building Trailblazer, you should be going Winged Moonplate first. This is no contest because not only is the health better than the Chain Vest, but Bami Cinder has a really good passive on it. So if you were building, either of these items, either Sunfire or Hollow Radiance, obviously you want to pick up Bami Cinder first. I would even make the argument that similar to Thornmail, in a lot of cases, well, you do get a little bit more damage. It's actually quite a decent amount more damage, but because you get more damage from Hollow Radiance or Sunfire Aegis, but you get access to the passive anyways, I would say again that instead of getting the more damage on, it's a little bit different than Thornmail because we're talking about like doubling the damage that Bami Cinder does, and there's no loss in terms of the anti-heal, which is the main reason why you build Thornmail. But when it comes to Bami Cinder, you can just sit on Bami Cinder, and now instead of taking an 800 gold component item or a 900 gold component item, and having to spend an extra 1700 gold to upgrade to Hollow Radiance or 1600 gold to upgrade to Sunfire. Instead, you can just sit on Bami's and then switch to another thing. But I mean, these items are in the never category, probably for a reason. I'm not going to go through Wit's End. This is like, not really in the scope of tank support items. It's just kind of an item like I like to remind people to not troll on Braum, I guess. Force of Nature. Yeah, so we talked about all of these already, right? So like obviously we're going to start with Ruby Crystal, and then like we said, Winged Moonplate versus Ruby Crystal is pretty close in power level. Can you get 150 health worth of value, either in 75 damage dealt and 75 damage dodged, because of 17 to 20 movement speed on a recall, like on one life cycle or one recall, one turn, whatever you want to call it? I think that you can, but I think that it's pretty close. So you could go either or. You could go Winged Moonplate or you could go Ruby Crystal. Obviously, Winged Moonplate, if you're combining it with Swiftness Boots, which I like to run like almost every game too. Swiftness Boots are really great right now. If you're combining it with, Swiftness Boots, it gets a little bit better. Because if you're already at tier 2 boots and you're at 400, but now imagine you have Swiftness Boots, imagine you also already have an item that's giving you more movement speed from somewhere else. Imagine you're playing a champion that has some built-in movement speed or something like that. Obviously, Winged Moonplate would get even a little bit stronger there. And then we'd go the No Magic Mantle into Negatron Cloak and then finish out Force of Nature. Did we do something like this with this? No, because there wasn't a Kindle Gem compared to it. Yeah, so for Spirit, is it Visage? I can't say the item ever. Spirit Visage? Visage. Somebody tell me how to pronounce Spirit Visage. I keep confusing Visage. I think it's Visage. And I keep confusing the word Visage with Mirage and combining them to make Visage. That sounds like, like Gucci or something like that. Like you got, what is it? Is there a brand? Verducci or something like that? It sounds like something like that. Like Gucci, Verducci, and Visage, something like that. Anyways, I would go, obviously you're going to start with the Rejuve bead, actually, like we talked about. Then you're going to get a Ruby Crystal. we run into this conundrum that we kind of talked about here, where now we have 700 gold towards Spectre's Cowl. And so we've got an extra 550 gold to get 25 magic resist and 50 health. Whereas for less than that, we could just pick up 150 health. So if you have the item slots, I would go Rejuve Bead, Ruby Crystal, Ruby Crystal, Kindle Gem. Or I guess you could even go Rejuve Bead, Kindle Gem, and then Ruby Crystal. Because I think we probably talked about this before too, but actually it's quite close between upgrading Ruby Crystal to Kindle Gem versus buying another Kindle Gem. Or buying another Ruby Crystal. Because you're getting an extra 50 HP plus 10 ability haste. So it's 10 ability haste on Kindle Gem versus 100 extra HP from another Ruby Crystal. And so if you feel like you can do an extra 100 damage or block an extra 100 damage or something like that because of 10 ability haste, which I think you probably can, then Kindle Gem would be better. And that's going to solve our itemization problem we're running into here, where we have all these weird components whenever we're trying to build Spectre's Cowl, because we like Rejuve Bead, but we also like the health, and so we end up going into the other side of the item. So I would go Rejuve Bead, then I would get Kindle Gem, then I would get Ruby Crystal, finish Cowl, and then get Spirit. Visage. So Spectre's Cowl used to be a lot better because it used to have a health regen passive for when you were getting poked. It's gone, and so don't be fooled by that. Dead Man's Plate. Okay, so we've talked about all these too. So it's like Ruby Crystal, Winged Moon Plate, Ruby Crystal, and then Cloth Armor, Chain Vest, and then Dead Man's Plate. So I hope that covers all of them. It's actually a little bit confusing, obviously. That's why it's tough. I learned the value of health regen today, and I hope that you did too. But keep in mind that it's, like I said at the beginning of the video, it's not very straightforward. It's not as simple as just build the more expensive one. It's not as simple always. We saw with like Warden's Mail versus Giant's Belt. It's not even always as simple as build the one that actually has a active or a passive on it versus one that's got, just base stats. Sometimes even the base stats can be better than one with an active or a passive on it. So hopefully this helps you identify which tank support components are better than others so that you can actually string your items together in a way that's kind of efficient for making you more tanky, and therefore helps you do better and win games. Because half the time or more that you're buying items, you're not just completing items. It's not just completed items. You're going through all these little components and sitting on these little components. If you're sitting on a component for 5 or 10 minutes during the game in between each item, you're spending a lot of time, probably more time than you're sitting on fully completed items, sitting on some component items. And so if you know how to build your component items correctly, that's going to be, pretty big impact a lot of the time during your game. Whereas if you're building the wrong ones that aren't as powerful as other ones by accident, you're building too many cloth armors and no magic mantles instead of ruby crystals and stuff like that, it's going to have a significantly major impact on how tanky you are in game, and you're going to do worse as a result because you're just not going to be as strong. So hope you guys found this one helpful. Unfortunately, it did take a little while, but hey, we did learn something today. And good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day.